How to completely change your life by accepting that no one cares. Stoic Motivation. Most people live their entire lives inside a quiet prison they never question. Not a prison made of walls or chains, but one built from a powerful illusion. The illusion that someone is always watching, always evaluating, always forming an opinion about who you are and what you are worth. Think about how often this invisible pressure shapes your behavior. You hesitate before speaking, carefully selecting words so you do not appear foolish. You rewrite messages before sending them, imagining how they might be interpreted. You replay conversations hours later, searching for mistakes that no one else may have even noticed. Sometimes you even avoid doing something you truly want because of a single thought that quietly appears in your mind. What will people think? It is a strange way to live when you look at it closely, a life directed not by reason, not by virtue, not even by your own desires, but by the imagined reactions of people who may not be paying attention at all. And yet this silent performance governs the lives of millions. People choose careers because they fear disappointment. They stay quiet when truth asks them to speak. They abandon ideas, ambitions, and even parts of their own character simply to avoid the discomfort of judgment. All of this because of an invisible audience. But pause for a moment and ask yourself something honestly. Who exactly is observing you this closely? Who is truly analyzing your life with the intensity you imagine? The mind answers quickly. Everyone. Everyone is watching. Everyone is noticing. Everyone is remembering. But reality is very different. Look at your own life. Think about the people around you, your colleagues, friends, strangers you pass during the day. How much time do you actually spend analyzing their actions? How often do you sit down and review their mistakes, their awkward moments, their failures? Almost never. Not because you are indifferent to them as human beings, but because your mind is already occupied. Occupied by your own concerns, your own uncertainties, your own responsibilities, your own future. The same truth applies to every other person walking through the world. They are not studying your life the way you imagine. They are not building careful judgments about your every decision. They are busy navigating their own worries and struggles. And this realization, while uncomfortable at first, contains a quiet liberation. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 2, Paragraph 1, that we waste precious energy worrying about what other people think of us, when the only thing truly within our control is our own mind and our own conduct. Consider how much of your life has been shaped by the fear of opinion. Moments when you remained silent even though you had something important to say. Opportunities you avoided because failure might be visible. Dreams postponed because you imagined someone might question your ability. This is not the result of external chains. No one forced these limitations upon you. They were created inside the mind itself. The mind imagines a crowd that rarely exists. And once that illusion is accepted as truth, a person begins to perform their life instead of living it. They measure their actions not by wisdom or virtue, but by approval. They begin asking questions that slowly weaken their courage. Will they like this? Will they respect me? Will I look foolish? But Stoic philosophy invites a different question entirely. Not what others will think, but what reason demands. Not how you appear, but how you act. And here is the paradox that many people resist at first. The moment you accept that the world is not watching you as closely as you believe, a certain weight begins to disappear. The fear of embarrassment loses its sharpness. The fear of judgment loses its authority. You begin to see something that was hidden before. Most people are not thinking about you nearly as much as you imagined. Not because they dislike you. Not because you are unimportant, but because they are busy carrying the same invisible burden you have been carrying. The burden of believing they are being watched too. And when this illusion begins to fade, a new kind of freedom quietly appears. A freedom that does not come from changing the world, but from changing the way you see it. A freedom that allows you to act with clarity instead of fear. To speak with honesty instead of calculation. To move through life guided by reason instead of approval. But to reach that freedom, one thing must happen first. You must see clearly the quiet lie that has shaped so much of your anxiety. The lie that tells you the world is watching. The lie that convinces you your worth depends on attention. And once you begin to question that lie, something powerful begins to happen inside your mind. You start realizing that the audience you feared so much may have never truly existed. The quiet lie we live under. From childhood, most people inherit a silent belief about the world without ever noticing when it was planted. No one announces it directly, yet it slowly takes root in the mind and begins shaping behavior in subtle ways. The belief is simple but powerful. Your life is being watched, evaluated, and remembered more than it truly is. Because of this belief, people begin to move through life carefully, almost as if they were standing on a stage. They measure their words before speaking, not always because truth requires it, but because they fear appearing foolish. They hold back ideas that might reveal ignorance. They avoid trying something new if there is a chance of failure being seen. Slowly, the natural courage of a human being begins to shrink, not because life demands caution, but because the mind imagines observers everywhere. Consider how often this invisible audience appears during ordinary moments. You walk into a room and suddenly become aware of how you stand, how you move, how you might appear. You make a small mistake and immediately feel a wave of embarrassment, as if the moment has been permanently recorded in the memory of everyone present. But pause and examine this belief carefully. How long do people actually remember the small mistakes of others? How much time do they truly spend analyzing someone else's awkward moment? Very little. The mind, however, magnifies these moments and turns them into lasting judgments. A brief event becomes, in our imagination, a permanent mark on our reputation. This is the quiet lie. The mind convinces us that our lives are under constant observation. It suggests that every misstep will be noticed and remembered, that every flaw will be silently recorded by those around us. Yet the Stoics understood something different about human attention. Epictetus explained in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 29, that people are far more concerned with their own impressions and concerns than with judging the lives of others. Each person is busy interpreting their own circumstances, wrestling with their own fears and trying to manage the direction of their own life. What feels like a spotlight on you is often nothing more than the echo of your own self-consciousness. The mind creates an audience where there may only be ordinary people passing through their own day. Once this lie settles into the mind, however, it begins to shape choices in quiet but powerful ways. A person avoids speaking up because they fear sounding ignorant. Another delays pursuing an ambition because failure might be visible. Someone else hides their true opinion because disagreement might lead to criticism. In each case, the same silent force is operating beneath the surface. The belief that others are watching closely enough for judgment to matter more than truth. But the Stoics insisted that this way of living leads to a life directed by shadows rather than reason. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that the opinions of others are fleeting and unstable. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, Paragraph 3, he reflects on how quickly the attention of the world moves on, how easily people forget what once seemed so important. What feels like permanent scrutiny is usually temporary curiosity. What feels like lasting judgment is often momentary attention. Yet the mind continues to exaggerate the importance of these imagined observations. It whispers that embarrassment will follow you. It warns that failure will define you. It suggests that every mistake will remain visible in the memory of others. And because of this quiet lie, many people begin performing their lives instead of living them. They become cautious where courage would serve them better. They remain silent where honesty would strengthen them. They postpone action while waiting for a perfect moment that will never arrive. But when you begin to question this illusion, something subtle begins to shift. You start noticing that the audience you feared rarely behaves the way your mind predicted. People move on quickly. They forget small mistakes. They return to their own concerns. And once you start seeing this clearly, another realization begins to emerge. One that changes how you understand human attention itself. You begin to see that most people are not focused on judging your life. They are busy trying to survive their own. The invisible weight of other people's opinions. Once you begin to see the quiet lie that shapes so much of human anxiety, another question naturally appears. If people are not watching as closely as we imagine, why do their opinions still carry so much weight in our minds? Why does the thought of being judged still have the power to disturb our peace? The answer is not always visible, because this pressure rarely arrives through direct criticism. Most of the time it exists as something far more subtle, an invisible expectation. A person may never openly tell you how to live your life, yet you feel the pressure to live up to what you think they expect. A parent may say very little, yet their imagined approval or disappointment quietly influences your decisions for years. A colleague may never criticize you, yet you carefully shape your behavior to avoid appearing weak or incapable in their eyes. Even strangers you will never meet again can influence your actions. You walk through a public place and suddenly become aware of yourself. Your posture changes, your voice changes, your behavior adjusts slightly, guided not by reason, but by the imagined judgments of people who may not even notice you. The mind is remarkably skilled at creating these invisible pressures. It builds expectations that no one explicitly demanded. It invents standards that no one clearly established. And then it punishes you emotionally for failing to meet them. This is why the opinions of others feel so heavy even when they are never spoken aloud. Because the mind fills the silence with its own interpretations. Seneca wrote about this danger in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 7, where he warns that the mind easily absorbs the expectations of the crowd and begins to imitate them without careful examination. When this happens, a person slowly loses their independence of judgment. Instead of asking what is wise, they begin asking what is approved. Instead of asking what is right, they begin asking what is acceptable. At first, the difference seems small, but over time, it becomes enormous. Because once approval becomes the measure of your actions, your life no longer belongs entirely to you. Your courage becomes conditional. Your honesty becomes cautious. Your decisions become negotiations between your conscience and the imagined reactions of others. The tragedy is not that people have opinions. Opinions are natural and every human being forms them constantly. The tragedy is when those opinions begin to dominate your inner world, when they begin shaping your choices more strongly than your own reasoning, when the fear of disapproval becomes stronger than the desire to act with integrity. And yet, if you examine the situation carefully, another truth quietly appears. The opinions you fear most often exist only in your imagination. You anticipate criticism that never arrives. You expect ridicule that never happens. You assume judgment from people who are too occupied with their own lives to notice your choices. The mind constructs entire scenarios about what others might think, and then reacts emotionally to those scenarios as if they were real. This is how invisible expectations become emotional burdens, not because they are imposed by the world, but because they are accepted without question inside the mind. Epictetus spoke directly about this in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 18, reminding his students that the disturbance we feel does not come from the actions of others, but from the judgments we attach to them. When someone forms an opinion about you, that opinion belongs to them. But when you allow that imagined opinion to govern your actions, the authority shifts into your own mind. You become both the prisoner and the guard. The more attention you give to these invisible expectations, the heavier they become. And the heavier they become, the more carefully you begin to live. You weigh every action. You anticipate every possible reaction. You move through life trying to satisfy standards that were never clearly defined. But something remarkable begins to happen when you start examining these invisible pressures honestly. You begin to notice how fragile they actually are. You notice how often the opinions you feared were never expressed. You notice how quickly people return to their own concerns. And slowly, another realization begins to emerge. The world you believed was judging you so carefully may be far more distracted than you thought. Because the truth is that most people are not studying your life. They are busy struggling with their own. The moment you realize everyone is busy surviving, there's a quiet moment of clarity that changes the way a person sees the world. It does not arrive through dramatic events. It usually comes through observation. You begin paying attention to the lives of others, and something slowly becomes impossible to ignore. Everyone is carrying something. The person sitting across from you is thinking about a problem you know nothing about. The colleague who seems confident is privately questioning their future. The stranger walking past you is dealing with worries, responsibilities, and fears that occupy their entire attention. When you truly begin to notice this, the world looks different. You realize that most people are not moving through life with the calm certainty we often imagine. They are navigating confusion, pressure, and uncertainty, just as you are. Each person is busy trying to solve the problems of their own existence. They are thinking about their families, their finances, their health, their regrets, their ambitions. Their minds are occupied with the same kind of internal dialogue that fills your own. And when a mind is full of its own concerns, it has very little space left to carefully analyze the life of someone else. This realization is both humbling and liberating. Humbling because it reminds us that we are not the center of other people's attention the way our fears sometimes suggest. Liberating because it dissolves a great deal of unnecessary pressure. The truth is simple, though the mind resists it at first. Most people are not judging you nearly as much as you imagine, not because they have reached some higher wisdom, but because they are too busy trying to manage their own lives. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this human reality in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 7, paragraph 21, where he reminds himself that every person you meet is guided by their own perceptions, their own concerns, and their own internal struggles. People do not act with you at the center of their attention. They act from within the small universe of their own mind. Once you see this clearly, many fears begin to lose their authority. The fear of embarrassment begins to soften. The fear of judgment begins to weaken, because you start to realize that the audience you feared so intensely is distracted by its own survival. Consider the moments when you felt most anxious about how others might see you. Perhaps you spoke in public and worried that every mistake would be noticed. Perhaps you tried something new and imagined people quietly criticizing your attempt. But now think about how quickly people return to their own thoughts after such moments. A brief glance, a passing observation, and then their attention moves back to their own concerns. Their mind returns to their own life. This is not cruelty. It is simply the structure of human attention. Each person carries their own story, and that story occupies most of their mental space. Once this becomes clear, a quiet form of freedom begins to emerge. You realize that many of the limitations you placed on yourself were created by an exaggerated sense of scrutiny. You thought others were carefully recording your failures. In reality, most people were too busy trying to avoid their own. Seneca spoke about this human tendency in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 11, reminding us that we often imagine an audience for our fears that does not truly exist. The mind projects attention where there is mostly indifference. And when you finally understand this, something important shifts inside you. The fear of being seen imperfectly begins to fade, because you understand that everyone else is too occupied trying to survive their own imperfections. Yet this realization opens the door to another insight, one that feels almost paradoxical at first. If the world is not paying as much attention to you as you believed, then something unexpected becomes possible. A form of freedom hidden inside the indifference of others. The unexpected freedom, hidden in indifference. At first, the idea that people are not paying much attention to you can feel unsettling. The mind is used to believing that attention equals importance, that recognition confirms value, that being noticed somehow proves that our actions matter. So when you begin to realize that most people are not studying your life, the mind may react with resistance. If no one is watching, does anything I do really matter? But this question comes from the same illusion that created the anxiety in the first place. It assumes that the value of your actions depends on the attention they receive. The Stoics saw the world differently. They did not measure a life by applause or recognition. They measured it by character, by intention, by the quiet discipline of doing what is right whether anyone is watching or not. And when you begin to adopt this perspective, something surprising happens. What once felt like indifference from the world begins to feel like freedom. Because if people are not observing your life as closely as you believed, then the fear that once controlled you begins to lose its power. The fear of embarrassment becomes lighter. The fear of appearing imperfect becomes less threatening. The fear of being judged begins to dissolve, not because the world has changed, but because you finally see it clearly. Most people are not dedicating their attention to evaluating your life. Their minds are occupied with their own struggles, their own ambitions, their own worries about how they appear to others. This means something very simple but very powerful. You are far more free than you believed, free to try things that may not succeed, free to speak honestly without rehearsing every sentence, free to explore paths that may look uncertain. The invisible cage that once surrounded your actions begins to open. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this idea often in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 12, Paragraph 4, where he reminds himself that the opinions of others are fleeting and unreliable. Today they praise you, tomorrow they forget you, and soon enough even the memory of both praise and criticism disappears entirely. If attention itself is temporary, why should it govern your decisions? Why should the imagined reactions of others determine the direction of your life? When you see the temporary nature of public opinion, you begin to realize how much unnecessary weight you have been carrying. You feared embarrassment as if it would follow you for years. Yet most people forget such moments within minutes. You feared criticism as if it would permanently shape how others see you, yet their attention moves quickly to the next concern in their own lives. Human attention is brief, unstable, and easily redirected. What once felt like a spotlight is often nothing more than a passing glance. And when you understand this deeply, courage begins to appear where fear once lived. You start taking small risks without the same emotional resistance. You express ideas without carefully measuring every possible reaction. You accept the possibility of failure because failure no longer feels like a permanent public record. Instead, it becomes what it truly is: a moment in your own process of learning. The world continues moving, people return to their own concerns, and life goes forward. This realization does not make your actions meaningless. It makes them honest. Because when you stop acting for the sake of attention, your actions begin to come from a deeper place. They come from your principles, from your judgment, from your sense of what is right. Epictetus spoke about this kind of freedom in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 25. He reminded his students that the person who depends on external approval can never truly be free, because their peace always depends on the reactions of others. But the person who acts according to reason carries their freedom within them. They do not need applause to confirm their worth. They do not fear silence from the crowd. They simply act as their character demands. And here a new question begins to appear. If freedom is found in letting go of external approval, why does the human mind cling to it so strongly? Why do we continue seeking validation even when we know how fragile it is? Why the mind clings to approval? Even after recognizing how little attention others truly give to our lives, something inside us continues searching for their approval. The mind understands the logic of freedom, yet the emotion remains. A person may know that the opinions of strangers do not define their worth, and still feel disturbed when criticism appears. This contradiction reveals something important about human nature. The desire for approval is not simply vanity. It is a deeply rooted instinct that once served a practical purpose. Long before modern society, belonging to a group meant survival. A human being rejected by their tribe faced real danger. Acceptance meant protection, cooperation, and security. Because of this history, the human mind developed a strong sensitivity to the reactions of others. Approval felt like safety. Disapproval felt like threat. Even today, the body reacts to social rejection with a tension that resembles physical danger. The heart accelerates, the mind becomes alert, and emotions rise quickly. This reaction is not proof that criticism is truly dangerous. It is simply evidence that the mind still carries ancient instincts. The Stoics understood this well. They did not expect human beings to eliminate emotion entirely. Instead, they taught that emotions must be examined and guided by reason. What the mind feels immediately is not always what the mind should obey. Epictetus explained this clearly in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 2, Chapter 18. He reminded his students that impressions appear in the mind without invitation, but the decision to accept or reject them remains within our control. When criticism appears, the first reaction may come from instinct. The body may tense, the mind may feel exposed. But what happens next belongs to your judgment. Do you treat that reaction as truth, or do you examine it? This is where Stoic discipline begins. Instead of blindly following the desire for approval, you pause and ask a different question. Is the opinion I fear actually important? Does it contain wisdom that can help me improve, or is it simply another passing judgment formed by someone with their own biases and concerns? When you begin asking these questions, something subtle changes in your relationship with approval. You stop treating it as a necessity. It becomes information rather than authority. Seneca addressed this idea in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 13, where he warned that many people surrender their peace to the shifting voices of the crowd. One day they feel confident because they are praised. The next day they feel diminished because they are criticized. Their stability rises and falls with opinions that change constantly. But the Stoic aims for a different foundation. Instead of building their self-respect on approval, they build it on character. They measure their actions according to reason and virtue, not according to applause. When praise comes, they accept it calmly without becoming dependent on it. When criticism appears, they examine it calmly without being crushed by it. In both cases, their center remains the same. This does not mean the desire for approval disappears overnight. Instinct does not vanish simply because reason understands it. But discipline gradually changes the relationship you have with that instinct. Instead of obeying it automatically, you begin observing it. You notice when the mind seeks validation. You notice when fear of judgment begins influencing your choices. And instead of surrendering to that pressure, you bring the situation back to a simple question. What is truly mine to control here? Because once you begin asking that question seriously, a clear line begins to appear. A line that separates what belongs to you from what never did. The first Stoic separation, what is yours and what never was. There is a moment in the study of Stoic philosophy when a simple idea appears. Yet once it is understood, it changes the way you look at nearly every difficulty in life. It is the realization that many of the things you worry about were never yours to control in the first place. Before this realization, the mind moves in every direction at once. It tries to manage outcomes, control opinions, predict reactions, and shape the future according to its desires. When events do not unfold as expected, frustration appears. When people respond differently than hoped, disappointment follows. The mind exhausts itself trying to influence forces that were never within its reach. Epictetus spoke about this with remarkable clarity in Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 1. He begins by reminding his students that some things in life are within our control, and some things are not. Within our control are our judgments, our intentions, our actions. Outside our control are reputation, outcomes, the reactions of others, and the countless events that unfold in the world. This separation may sound simple, yet most human suffering grows from ignoring it. Think about how often anxiety appears when you try to manage what belongs to the second category. You speak carefully, hoping others will approve of what you say. You work tirelessly, hoping success will arrive exactly when you expect it. You present your best self, hoping people will recognize your value. And when these things do not happen the way you imagined, the mind begins to resist reality. Why did they not appreciate this? Why did this not work? Why did things turn out differently? But notice what all these questions have in common. They focus on outcomes that depend on forces outside your command. Other people's opinions are not yours to command. Their attention is not yours to command. Their approval is not yours to command. Yet many people build their peace on precisely these unstable foundations. The Stoics saw the danger in this. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that peace cannot be built on external events. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 47, he reflects that a person's tranquility depends on their own judgments, not on the unpredictable behavior of the world around them. When you truly understand this, A boundary begins to form inside your mind. On one side of that boundary are things that belong to you. Your character, your effort, your honesty, your discipline. These are always within your reach. On the other side are things that never belong to you. The applause of others, the recognition you may or may not receive, the outcomes shaped by countless external factors. When this distinction becomes clear, something important changes. You stop investing emotional energy in territories you cannot govern. Instead of trying to control how people see you, you focus on acting with integrity. Instead of obsessing over outcomes, you focus on the quality of your effort. Instead of fearing judgment, you return your attention to the one place where your authority is real, your own mind. This is the beginning of internal sovereignty. A person who understands this separation becomes less fragile, not because life becomes easier, but because their expectations become realistic. They no longer demand control over what never belonged to them. They accept that the world will respond according to its own nature, and within that acceptance, a new kind of stability begins to form. But once you begin practicing this separation honestly, another truth quickly becomes visible. You start to see how much of your life was spent fighting battles that could never be won. Battles against uncertainty, battles against the opinions of others, battles against outcomes that were never guaranteed. And when you look back at the energy spent on these struggles, one question becomes impossible to avoid. How much strength have you wasted trying to control what cannot be controlled? The energy you waste, fighting the uncontrollable. Once you begin to understand the Stoic separation between what is yours and what never was, something uncomfortable becomes visible. You start noticing how much of your life has been spent in resistance. Resistance to opinions you cannot command. Resistance to outcomes you cannot predict. Resistance to events that have already happened and cannot be changed. The mind, by habit, fights these things constantly. It replays conversations long after they are over. It imagines different ways you could have spoken, different reactions you could have created, different impressions you might have left behind. Hours are spent arguing with moments that already belong to the past. At other times, the mind moves into the future, trying to control what has not yet arrived. It anticipates criticism that may never happen. It prepares defenses against judgments that may never appear. The body feels tension, the mind feels pressure, yet nothing in the external world has actually occurred. This is the quiet exhaustion many people carry every day. Not the exhaustion of physical labor, but the exhaustion of mental resistance. Seneca observed this pattern clearly in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 13. He noted that much of human suffering comes from imagining troubles before they arrive, allowing fear to drain strength long before any real difficulty appears. The mind spends energy fighting shadows, and because these shadows are endless, the struggle never ends. One worry dissolves only to be replaced by another. One imagined judgment fades, and the mind immediately begins constructing the next. This is why so many people feel constantly tired even when their external lives appear manageable. Their energy is being consumed by battles that cannot be won. Consider how much strength is spent trying to manage how others perceive you. You adjust your behavior to avoid misunderstanding. You carefully shape your words so no one forms the wrong impression. You try to present the best version of yourself at all times. Yet even with all this effort, people will still interpret your actions according to their own experiences, their own biases, and their own concerns. You cannot enter another person's mind and guide their judgment. Their opinion is formed in a place you cannot reach, and yet many people exhaust themselves trying to influence that unreachable space. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this often in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 52. He wrote that when we are disturbed by external events, it is not the event itself that disturbs us, but our judgment about it. The disturbance grows when we insist that reality should behave differently than it does. The more you demand control over the uncontrollable, the more tension you create inside your own mind. This is why the Stoics placed such importance on accepting the structure of reality. Not because acceptance makes life passive, but because acceptance stops the waste of strength. When you stop arguing with what cannot be changed, energy begins returning to you. Energy that was once spent replaying conversations becomes available for learning from them. Energy that was once spent anticipating criticism becomes available for improving your actions. Energy that was once spent fearing judgment becomes available for pursuing meaningful work. The difference is profound. Instead of scattering your attention across endless uncertainties, you concentrated on what actually belongs to you: your effort, your discipline, your character. And once you begin experiencing the calm that follows this shift, another realization begins to emerge. If so much suffering comes from resisting reality, then perhaps peace begins with something very simple: learning to accept reality exactly as it is. The discipline of accepting reality as it is. At first, the word acceptance often sounds like weakness. The mind hears it and imagines surrender, passivity, a quiet resignation to whatever happens. Many people resist the idea immediately because they believe accepting reality means giving up the desire to improve it. But this misunderstanding disappears once you look more closely at what the Stoics actually meant. Acceptance does not mean approving of everything that happens. It means recognizing what has already happened and refusing to waste your strength denying it. Reality does not change simply because the mind argues with it. If someone misunderstands you, the misunderstanding already exists. If a mistake has been made, the mistake has already occurred. If circumstances unfold differently than you hoped, that moment has already become part of the world. The mind often responds to these moments with resistance. It repeats the same internal questions again and again. Why did this happen? Why did they react this way? Why did things not unfold the way I planned? But notice something important. These questions often contain an unspoken demand. They demand that reality be different from what it already is. And as long as the mind insists on this demand, tension continues. Marcus Aurelius returned to this idea repeatedly in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. In Book 4, paragraph 23, he reminds himself that the world unfolds according to causes that stretch far beyond his personal wishes. Fighting those causes does not change them. It only disturbs the person who refuses to accept them. The Stoic approach begins with a simple but powerful step. See reality clearly, not as you wish it had been, not as you hoped it would become, but exactly as it stands in this moment. When you accept the present situation fully, something remarkable happens. The struggle between your mind and reality ends. You stop asking why the moment exists and begin asking what you can do with it. This shift transforms acceptance into a form of strength. Instead of wasting energy resisting the past, you direct your attention toward action in the present. If someone criticizes you unfairly, acceptance does not mean agreeing with the criticism. It means acknowledging that the criticism has been expressed and deciding calmly how to respond. If a plan fails, acceptance does not mean abandoning your goals. It means recognizing the failure honestly and adjusting your next step without resentment. Seneca described this discipline in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 98. He explains that a wise person does not demand that events follow their wishes. Instead, they align their will with the reality that unfolds before them. This alignment does not weaken a person. It stabilizes them. Because once you stop arguing with the structure of reality, your mind becomes clearer. You see the situation as it truly is. You identify what remains within your control. And from that clarity, deliberate action becomes possible. The energy that was once trapped in frustration becomes available for judgment and effort. Many people resist this discipline because they confuse acceptance with defeat. But the Stoics understood something different. Defeat occurs when a person allows events to break their character. Acceptance occurs when a person refuses to let events disturb their reason. A person who accepts reality calmly becomes far more capable of shaping what comes next. They are not distracted by resentment. They are not weakened by denial. They remain steady enough to act wisely. And as this steadiness grows, a new kind of courage begins to appear. The courage to act according to reason even when no one applauds. The courage to act without applause. Once you begin accepting reality as it is, another quiet challenge appears. You realize that many of your actions were never guided entirely by reason or by virtue. They were guided by the expectation of recognition. The mind grows accustomed to applause. It becomes comfortable when effort is noticed, when discipline is praised, when others confirm that what you are doing is valuable. In those moments, action feels easier because the reward arrives quickly. But life does not always offer that reward. Many of the most important actions in a person's life happen in silence. No one notices the discipline required to remain honest when dishonesty would be easier. No one sees the effort involved in improving yourself day after day. No one applauds the private decisions that shape your character. This is where true courage begins to appear, not the courage that appears in dramatic moments, but the quieter courage of acting well without the reassurance of approval. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this discipline constantly. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 5, Paragraph 1, he reminds himself that the work of a human being is not to seek praise but to fulfill the duties of reason and nature. Just as a vine produces grapes without asking to be admired, a person should perform their role without demanding recognition. The value of the action lies in the action itself. Yet the mind often resists this idea. It asks whether the effort is worth it if no one notices. It wonders whether discipline matters if it does not lead to visible success. It questions whether integrity has meaning when it brings no immediate reward. These doubts arise because the mind has been trained to associate value with attention. But Stoic philosophy offers a different measure. An action is valuable when it reflects virtue, when it aligns with honesty, courage, fairness, and wisdom. When it strengthens your character rather than weakening it. Whether the world notices this action is secondary, because the most important witness to your life is your own conscience. If you rely on applause to sustain your actions, your motivation becomes fragile. Praise may encourage you one day, but criticism will weaken you the next. Approval may push you forward in one moment, but indifference may cause you to stop. Your direction becomes dependent on forces outside your control. But when you learn to act without waiting for recognition, your stability changes completely. You work because the work is worth doing. You speak honestly because honesty is required. You pursue discipline because your character demands it. The reactions of others no longer determine whether the action is meaningful. Epictetus described this kind of independence in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 19. He reminded his students that a person who depends on praise becomes the servant of those who give it. But a person who acts according to reason carries their authority within themselves. This is the beginning of real freedom. You no longer wait for permission from the crowd. You no longer measure your worth through their reactions. You simply act according to the principles you know to be right. At first, this discipline feels unfamiliar. The mind still searches for signs of approval. It still notices when recognition does not arrive. But with practice, the silence of the crowd becomes less important. What matters is the clarity of your own judgment. And from that clarity, a new kind of strength slowly develops. The strength of becoming a person who no longer depends on the guidance of others to determine the direction of their life. The quiet strength of becoming self-guided. When you begin acting without waiting for applause, something subtle begins to change inside you. At first, the shift is small, almost invisible. You simply notice that your decisions start coming from a different place. Instead of asking what others expect, you begin asking what is reasonable. Instead of adjusting your behavior to match the crowd, you start examining your own judgment more carefully. This is the beginning of becoming self-guided. Many people move through life guided by signals coming from outside themselves. Approval encourages them. Criticism discourages them. The reactions of others quietly determine how confident or uncertain they feel. Their inner stability rises and falls depending on voices that do not belong to them. When praise arrives, they feel secure. When it disappears, they begin doubting themselves. When criticism appears, they question the path they were certain about only moments before. This kind of dependence makes a person fragile, not because they lack intelligence or effort, but because the source of their direction lies outside their control. Stoic philosophy proposed a different foundation. Instead of depending on external reactions, a person should cultivate an inner guide formed by reason and character. This guide does not ignore the world, but it refuses to surrender authority to it. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to return to this inner authority. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 30, he writes that a person should retreat into their own ruling mind, where the principles of reason remain untouched by the noise of public opinion. Inside that space, judgment becomes clear. You ask yourself simple but demanding questions. Is this action honest? Is it fair? Does it strengthen my character or weaken it? These questions do not require applause. They require reflection, and once you begin living according to these standards, a new kind of strength begins to form. It is quieter than the confidence that comes from praise, but far more stable. Because it does not depend on the approval of others. You begin to trust your own judgment more deeply, not because you assume you are always correct, but because you know that your decisions are guided by deliberate thought rather than by fear of opinion. This kind of trust develops slowly. At first, the mind still looks outward for reassurance. It still wonders whether others will agree with your choices. It still feels the familiar discomfort when your actions differ from what people expect. But over time, that discomfort becomes less powerful. You start noticing that disagreement does not destroy your peace. You see that criticism does not automatically mean you are wrong. You realize that approval is pleasant, but unnecessary. Seneca addressed this growing independence in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 71. He wrote that the wise person does not measure themselves by the shifting voices of the crowd, but by the steady standards of virtue. The crowd praises one thing today and another tomorrow. Reason remains constant. As your reliance on reason strengthens, the influence of external opinion begins to fade. You listen to others without becoming controlled by them. You consider advice without surrendering your judgment. Your life begins to feel more directed, more intentional, more aligned with principles that come from within rather than from outside approval. And with this new stability comes another challenge that every person eventually encounters. When you begin living according to your own reason, there will be moments when others misunderstand you, moments when your intentions are questioned, moments when your choices do not make sense to those around you. Learning to remain steady in those moments requires another layer of discipline. Learning to be misunderstood without losing yourself. At some point, every person who begins living according to their own reason encounters the same uncomfortable experience. They are misunderstood, not slightly misunderstood, but completely misread. Their intentions are interpreted in ways they never intended. Their actions are judged through assumptions that have nothing to do with their true character. This moment often surprises people who have spent years trying to behave carefully and responsibly. They believe that if they act with integrity, others will naturally recognize it. But life rarely works that way. People do not see the world exactly as it is. They see it through their own experiences, their own fears, their own expectations. When they observe your actions, they interpret them through the lens of their own mind. This means that even your most sincere efforts may sometimes appear suspicious, arrogant, careless, or strange to someone else. The mind often reacts strongly to this moment. It wants to correct the misunderstanding immediately. It wants to explain every detail, defend every intention, repair every misinterpretation. Part of this impulse comes from the same instinct that seeks approval. If others misunderstand you, it feels like a threat to your reputation. But Stoic philosophy asks you to examine this situation differently. Epictetus addressed this directly in Discourses of Epictetus, Book 1, Chapter 29. He reminded his students that the opinion others form about you belongs to their judgment, not yours. You may clarify your actions if necessary, but you cannot control how their mind ultimately interprets what you do. Their perception remains their responsibility. This realization can be uncomfortable at first because it challenges the desire to be seen accurately by everyone. Most people want their intentions to be understood. They want their actions to be interpreted fairly. But the Stoics understood that this wish, while natural, cannot always be satisfied. Even the most thoughtful explanation cannot fully control how another person interprets your behavior. Their interpretation depends on their own beliefs, their own mood, their own experiences. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this reality in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 11, paragraph 18. He reminded himself that when others criticize or misunderstand him, he must examine whether the criticism contains truth. If it does, he should improve. If it does not, he should remain calm and continue acting according to reason. The key is not whether others approve of you. The key is whether your actions remain aligned with virtue. This discipline requires a certain emotional maturity. Instead of reacting defensively each time someone misunderstands you, you learn to pause and examine the situation calmly. Is there something in this criticism that reveals a real weakness I should correct? If the answer is yes, then the misunderstanding becomes an opportunity for improvement. If the answer is no, then the misunderstanding becomes something you allow to pass without disturbing your mind. In both cases, your stability remains intact. You no longer depend on universal approval to confirm your character. You accept that being misunderstood is sometimes part of living honestly. This acceptance does not mean you ignore communication or refuse to clarify your intentions when appropriate. It simply means that your peace does not depend on controlling how every person perceives you. Some people will understand your intentions, others will not. Your responsibility is not to control their perception. Your responsibility is to maintain your integrity. When this discipline becomes stronger, something interesting begins to happen. Misunderstanding stops feeling like a personal attack. It becomes another ordinary part of human interaction. And as this calm acceptance grows, the fear of public failure begins to lose its power as well. When failure stops being a public event, one of the deepest fears that holds people back is not failure itself. It is the idea that failure will be seen, remembered, and judged. The mind imagines a mistake becoming a permanent mark on your reputation. It pictures others quietly observing your failure and forming lasting conclusions about your ability, your intelligence, or your worth. Because of this fear, many people hesitate before acting. They wait for perfect preparation, perfect timing, perfect certainty that the outcome will succeed. But life rarely offers these conditions. And while a person waits for them, opportunities quietly pass. The Stoics approached failure from a completely different angle. They did not see it as a public spectacle, but as a private moment of instruction. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this attitude in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 50. He reminded himself that mistakes are natural parts of action. What matters is not avoiding every error, but correcting the judgment that produced it. In other words, failure is not evidence that you are incapable. It is evidence that you are participating in life. The mind often exaggerates how visible these moments truly are. It imagines that every mistake will attract attention and criticism. But as you have already begun to see, most people are far too occupied with their own concerns to examine your failures closely. A brief moment of attention may appear, but it rarely lasts. The world moves quickly. People return to their own responsibilities, their own worries, their own ambitions. What felt like a major public event in your mind often becomes a passing moment in the attention of others. This realization transforms the meaning of failure. Instead of becoming a public judgment, it becomes a private lesson. You examine what happened. You identify the decision that led to the mistake. You adjust your thinking and move forward with better understanding. Seneca addressed this process clearly in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 28. He explained that progress requires the willingness to see one's own errors without shame. A person who refuses to acknowledge mistakes cannot improve, but a person who studies them calmly gains strength from the experience. The obstacle becomes instruction. This attitude removes the emotional weight that often surrounds failure. Instead of treating mistakes as personal humiliation, you begin treating them as information. Information about where your reasoning can improve. Information about where your preparation can become stronger. Information about where your discipline can grow. Once failure is understood in this way, the fear that once prevented action begins to dissolve. You no longer delay your efforts because you are trying to avoid embarrassment. You accept that mistakes are part of the process of learning. And because you no longer treat failure as a public spectacle, your courage increases. You speak more freely. You attempt new challenges. You experiment with ideas that once felt too risky. Not because you enjoy failing, but because you no longer exaggerate its importance. Failure becomes something temporary, a moment of correction rather than a permanent label. And as the fear of failure loses its influence, another change begins to appear inside your mind. The noise created by external judgment becomes quieter. The pressure to impress others becomes less urgent. Life begins to simplify. The calm that comes from reducing the world to its essentials. When the fear of judgment begins to fade and failure loses its exaggerated importance, something unexpected begins to happen inside the mind. Life becomes quieter, not because the world itself has changed, but because much of the unnecessary noise that once filled your thoughts begins to disappear. For years, many people carry an invisible burden created by questions that never truly mattered. Questions about how they appear, how they are perceived, how others may interpret their actions. These questions create constant background tension. Even during ordinary moments, the mind remains alert, measuring reactions, predicting judgments, imagining how one small action might affect reputation. But when you begin releasing the need for approval, that entire layer of mental activity starts to dissolve. You no longer need to monitor every impression you create. You no longer need to calculate every possible interpretation others may form. Instead, your attention begins to return to something much simpler: your own conduct. Marcus Aurelius often brought himself back to this simplicity. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 4, paragraph 24, he reminds himself that the task of a human being is not complicated. It is simply to act justly, to think clearly, and to accept whatever the moment brings with dignity. When the mind returns to these essentials, life becomes easier to navigate. Instead of managing endless external expectations, you focus on a few internal principles. Act honestly, think carefully, treat others fairly, do your work with discipline. Everything else becomes secondary. This simplicity does not make life shallow. In fact, it deepens it, because your energy is no longer scattered across dozens of imagined concerns. It is concentrated on what actually matters: the quality of your character, the clarity of your judgment, the steadiness of your actions. Seneca described this kind of mental simplicity in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 32. He warned that the mind becomes exhausted when it tries to attend to too many external influences at once. But when attention is directed toward a few meaningful principles, the mind becomes calmer and stronger. You begin to notice the difference in everyday moments. Decisions that once felt complicated become straightforward. You no longer ask how an action might appear to others. You ask whether it is right. You no longer hesitate because you fear disapproval. You act because your judgment tells you it is the proper course. The mind becomes less cluttered. The internal conversation becomes quieter. You stop carrying the constant pressure of maintaining an image. Instead, you simply maintain your character. And character requires far less effort than performance, because performance constantly adjusts to the expectations of others, while character follows consistent principles. This is where a deeper calm begins to appear. Not the fragile calm that depends on favorable circumstances, but the stable calm that comes from alignment between your actions and your values. You know what matters. You know what belongs to you. You know what does not deserve your energy. And as this clarity grows, something else begins to open before you. You start to see what life could look like if you stopped performing entirely. The life that opens when you stop performing. Once the need for approval fades, and your attention returns to what truly belongs to you, something remarkable begins to happen. You start living instead of performing. For much of their lives, many people move through the world as if they are constantly on display. They adjust their words, their choices, even their ambitions according to how they believe others might react. It becomes a quiet form of theater. A person presents the version of themselves that seems safest, the version that invites the least criticism, the version that attracts the most approval. But a life built on performance slowly distances a person from their own nature. Decisions become cautious. Ideas remain unspoken. Paths that feel meaningful are abandoned because they might appear uncertain or unconventional. When this performance ends, an entirely different landscape begins to appear. You speak with greater honesty because you are no longer rehearsing every sentence for approval. You pursue work that genuinely matters to you, instead of work that simply looks impressive to others. You allow yourself to explore possibilities that once felt too risky because the fear of judgment has lost its authority. The change is subtle at first. You begin noticing small moments of authenticity that once felt uncomfortable. You express a thought without carefully adjusting it to satisfy everyone listening. You admit uncertainty without fearing that it will damage your reputation. You pursue an idea simply because you believe it is worth pursuing. These moments accumulate. Gradually, the space between who you are and how you present yourself begins to disappear. Marcus Aurelius reflected on this kind of authenticity in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 6, paragraph 30. He reminds himself that a person should live in agreement with their own nature, not with the shifting expectations of others. To live according to one's nature is to act with sincerity, not arrogance, not defiance, but honesty. You stop asking how your life will appear from the outside. You begin asking whether your actions align with reason and virtue. This shift transforms how you experience freedom. Freedom is no longer the absence of criticism. Freedom becomes the ability to act without being governed by it. When someone approves of your work, you receive it calmly without becoming dependent on it. When someone criticizes your choices, you examine the criticism without allowing it to define you. Your direction remains the same because it is guided by your own judgment. Seneca wrote about this quiet independence in Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, Letter 29. He explains that the person who seeks constant approval becomes a servant of those who give it, but the person who lives according to reason carries their dignity within themselves. They do not perform their life for an audience, they live it. As this independence grows, another realization becomes impossible to ignore. The peace you once searched for in recognition was never located in the attention of others. It was waiting in the one place you had not fully trusted yet: your own will. The final freedom, living by your own will. There is a point in this journey where the mind finally becomes quiet enough to see a truth that was always present. Peace was never located in the attention of others, not in their approval, not in their recognition, not in their understanding of who you are. For most of their lives, many people search for stability in places that cannot provide it. They hope that if others respect them, they will finally feel secure. They hope that if their efforts are recognized, their worth will feel confirmed. But these things are unstable by nature. Attention shifts. Opinions change. Praise that appears today disappears tomorrow. If your peace depends on these forces, then your peace will always remain fragile. The Stoics understood this clearly. They taught that the only place where true stability can exist is within the governance of one's own mind. Epictetus expressed this idea with remarkable simplicity in Enchiridion of Epictetus, paragraph 1. He reminds us that the only things truly ours are our judgments, our choices, and our actions. Everything else moves according to causes outside our control. Once this distinction becomes real in your life, a profound shift takes place. You stop negotiating your character with the world. You stop asking permission from public opinion. You stop measuring your worth through reactions that come and go. Instead, your attention returns fully to the one domain that has always belonged to you: your will. Your will decides whether you act with honesty or deception. Your will decides whether you face difficulty with courage or avoidance. Your will decides whether you allow criticism to disturb your mind or pass through it without resistance. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that no external event has the power to damage the ruling faculty of the mind unless we allow it. In Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 8, paragraph 48, he reflects that the inner mind remains free as long as it refuses to surrender its judgment to external pressures. This is the freedom that Stoic philosophy points toward: not freedom from hardship, not freedom from criticism, not freedom from uncertainty, but freedom within them. The freedom to maintain clarity while circumstances change. The freedom to remain steady while opinions shift. The freedom to act according to reason even when the world does not applaud. When a person reaches this point, something important disappears. The constant tension of trying to control how others see you. The endless effort to perform a life designed for approval. The fear that your value depends on the attention of people who are busy living their own lives. In its place, something stronger appears. Self-respect. The quiet knowledge that your actions are guided by principles you have chosen deliberately. The calm awareness that your character does not belong to the crowd. It belongs to you. And once this understanding settles deeply into the mind, life begins to feel lighter. You stop carrying expectations that were never yours to fulfill. You stop fearing judgments that were never yours to control. You simply focus on living well, acting with honesty, thinking with clarity, facing reality without illusion. Because in the end, the world may or may not care about what you do, but your character will always know. And when your will aligns with reason, when your actions follow virtue rather than approval, you carry something far more valuable than recognition. You carry an inner freedom that no circumstance and no opinion can take away.